But in the meantime, Lincoln asked for troops for 90 days. He thought the war was going to end very, very soon. And so he got the troops, and finally another big battle happened, the Battle of Bull Run, and the Union lost. The battle happened 25 miles away. Troops came back defeated. Over 600 dead, 2,000 wounded. Now, by this point, Lincoln believes, well, you know what we need now is we need George Washington. We need a general, a young Napoleon. And they call this man the young Napoleon, George McClellan. Lincoln hires this man to become commanding general of the Union troops and decided this guy could help us win the war. So anyway, McClellan said, I can do it all. This guy was extremely arrogant, extremely arrogant. But he begins training and preparing the troops. Young Napoleon, George McClellan, starts preparing and training the troops, and training the troops, and training the troops, and training the troops. He created a huge war machine, and when he did, he continued to train and prepare the troops. Lincoln was saying, would you get on with it already, go out and fight somebody? But McClellan continued to train, saying, we're not ready yet. So now summer turns into the fall. And what did McClellan think about Lincoln? Well, McClellan said that he knew more than Lincoln. He didn't like Lincoln's backward manner. He didn't like Lincoln's clothes. He thought Lincoln was very crude. He said that Lincoln was a baboon, that he was some kind of a superior gorilla. A lot of men in the cabinet urged Lincoln to fire McClellan, said, just get somebody else, forget this guy. But Lincoln said no. Lincoln said that if he could hold McClellan's horse, and if that could save the Union, he would be willing to do that. Lincoln took no holidays. Lincoln did not go on vacation. Lincoln rarely had dinners with his wife. He was very busy. He was always sitting around, and I'm going to show you some pictures here. A very lonely, dejected Lincoln. He had a lot of days like this. And here you are, sitting by the telegraph machine, which was kind of an innovation at the time. Lincoln was occupied with this war. Mary, who was very busy shopping, was given the task of refurbishing the White House. She said the White House looked like a dump. So she said, okay, she wanted money. The Congress gave her $20,000 to buy things to refurbish the White House, and she spent $30,000. And Lincoln was pissed, and he was willing to dig up those $10,000 somehow and pay it back himself. But Congress bailed him out. Basically, they said, well, not to worry about it. That what they would do is they took some money from an appropriations bill from the following year and kind of buried it and covered those $90,000. Okay. Robert Kennedy. Now, again, I don't have a picture of the young Robert Kennedy, but Robert Kennedy had gone off to Harvard. But the two remaining boys that Lincoln's had, they were Willie and Tad, were very undisciplined. And Lincoln, he was not a disciplinarian. He was very affectionate by this point. They were running around doing whatever the heck they wanted. Willie and Tad would break windows. They'd interrupt cabinet meetings. One time they would play war in the house, and they would hang a little, they told Abraham Lincoln, we caught this traitor, a little doll or something, and say, could you pardon him? President said, well, by the power invested in me, I pardon this doll. We're going to hang him anyway, he's a traitor. And they'd hang the doll. And they would get soldiers to lend him a gun, and they shoot a bullet in the air. And Lincoln would just laugh. He did not discipline the boys at all. Willie was Lincoln's favorite. As much as we like to say parents don't play favorites, Willie was Lincoln's favorite, a very sweet boy. Tad himself. Now, by the way, Tad, I believe I mentioned in the last video, his real name was Thomas, but they called him Tad. Okay, Abraham Lincoln begins studying military tactics because he's just getting tired of waiting for George McClellan, and he's saying, the more I learn, the more I could tell this guy to do something. Mary, by the way, starts spending money. She never got over the death of Eddie that we mentioned in the last video. Abraham Lincoln starts pushing for a battle to happen. But at a certain point, Mary finally refurbishes the White House. She refurbishes the White House. They have this grand party to show it off. But what happened? Little Willie got sick. Little Willie got typhoid. And Mary and Abraham kind of went to his side during the party. They would just go up and down the stairs, and they spent a lot of the time with little Willie. Little Willie died of typhoid. And Mary, this is her second son that she had lost. she went into these convulsions. She would just cry and cry and cry and go into convulsions. Now, Abraham Lincoln, when he looked down at little Willie, said to somebody, this is hard. It is going to be so hard to see him go. Mary was not able to go to the funeral. She was upstairs, and this is around the time that Elizabeth Keckley, the ex-slave, she was a slave, the maid now in the White House, became a confidant of Mary Lincoln. And Elizabeth Keckley had also lost a son. She consoled Mary Lincoln the best she could. Now, Mary Lincoln did not trust the gossip in Washington, D.C. and started relying more and more on the trust of Elizabeth Keckley. Abraham Lincoln again started burying his grief and pouring himself out in his work. Now, in one of my previous videos, I'm sorry for this, I'm sweating over here, but in one of my previous videos, I mentioned President Franklin Pierce, who also lost a son in tragic circumstances, his remaining son, and he turned into an alcoholic. Or I should say, fell off the wagon and continued being an alcoholic. Abraham Lincoln, by contrast, poured himself into his work, but he was really not able to help his wife with her grief. And he wasn't really even given the time to grieve himself, you could say. Little Tad now, believe it or not, around this time, Tad gets sick. Little Tad gets sick. But Mary was in so much grief, she wasn't really able to attend to Tad very much. Tad had a very, very bad time. He recovered, by the way, from that. But he had a very, very hard time. I mean, Robert was way older. His older brother, Willie, just died. They had a good friend that, for XYZ reason, was no longer visiting the White House, and Tad felt very, very much alone by this point. March 1862, finally, for Abraham Lincoln, some good news, some welcome news, I should say. George McClellan decides, we're going to fight. He takes his men, 121,000 men, 14,000 horses, 1,100 wagons. We're going to go push 70 miles to Richmond, Virginia. We're going to attack the South. And they start moving and moving. And when they're going to attack the South, I should mention the Southern General, Southern Commanding General. I'm sure you've heard of him, General Robert E. Lee. George McClellan was going to go fight against Robert E. Lee. So George McClellan pushes forward. And he pushes forward and gets closer and closer to Richmond, Virginia. But at one point, he stalls. And Abraham Lincoln gets a telegram, and he's wondering, what's going on here? Why did you stop? And McClellan says that he's convinced that Robert E. Lee has superior numbers, which he didn't. And he wants Lincoln to send him reinforcement. Lincoln is like, you have over 100,000 men. Get on with it. Okay. Now, he moves on. I should mention that Mary Lincoln, remember, she's from the South. 3 of her brothers and 3 brothers-in-law are fighting for the South, for the rebels. And a lot of people were criticizing Mary, thinking she came from a rebel family, which in essence, you could say that she did. But she was a firm unionist. Not a lot of people saw that. Okay, but anyway, going on. Ulysses S. Grant. Remember that name if you don't already know it. Ulysses S. Grant, General Ulysses S. Grant, fought at Shiloh and won that battle. A tremendous victory. Even though, however, at the end of that battle, 20,000 men died in that battle, including one of Mary Lincoln's half-brothers. One of her rebel brothers died in that battle. McClellan, going on. Remember, he stalled? Well, he starts pushing forward again. And McClellan pushes forward towards Richmond, Virginia. And he's 6 miles away. And he stops again. And Abraham Lincoln, what are you doing? Well, McClellan, by the time McClellan could do anything, Robert E. Lee fights. He was able to get his own reinforcements, get his men together, and fight against George McClellan, and the Union Army had to retreat. George McClellan had to retreat his army. Now, what did George McClellan say about this? Little arrogant General George McClellan. What did he say about all that? He didn't say that he lost. He said, I didn't lose. I merely failed to win because they had superior numbers, which was, by the way, not true. 14 weeks of marching and pushing forward, and George McClellan couldn't do it. Lincoln was extremely depressed, and not on to make things worse, everybody blamed him for this. He felt dejected. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. Mary, in the meantime, he couldn't reach out to as much as he tried at a certain point. But Mary, what does she do when she gets depressed? You probably already know. She went shopping. She would buy things and not open the boxes. Mary bought 300 pairs of gloves of unopened stuff. By this point, slaves started escaping, and I thought I had brought a picture here, and I don't know if I did. Oh, my fault. My apologies. Slaves started escaping the South and going north. Now, remember that Lincoln at this point was not going to outlaw slavery quite yet. In fact, the Union was actually sending some slaves back. They were trying to please the South as much as possible, see if they could end this war one way or the other. Elizabeth Keckley, who I mentioned, her son died in the Union. She opens what we call the Contraband Relief Association. She was giving food and clothing and shelter, whatever she could. She would gather money to help these slaves that were escaping the South and going north. And they would build little refugee camps around the White House or anywhere in D.C., and Elizabeth Keckley was doing that. And in the process of doing that, she actually acquired the help of Mary Todd Lincoln to help her. And Mary Todd Lincoln did, side by side with this former black slave, Elizabeth Keckley, which if you read Elizabeth Keckley's biography, she was 30 years a slave, became a slave at 4 years old, had been whipped, had been raped, bought her own freedom, bought her son's freedom. Her son died fighting for the Union. She told Mary, sometimes it helps when you help other people. And Mary Todd Lincoln did find comfort helping these escaped slaves and also helping soldiers in the military hospitals. She started doing that. An amazing woman, Elizabeth Keckley. Lincoln got together with black leaders. And I mentioned Frederick Douglass. Lincoln got together in the White House with black leaders, including Frederick Douglass. And he had a proposition. He said, blacks and whites, obviously, we're not getting along here in the United States. And from what I see, you are not welcome here. And it would be better for everybody if you just left. That he would acquire some land in most likely Liberia, Africa, and we could get all the slaves and the former slaves and all the black people, free slaves. You all go to Liberia, I could buy this land and give it to you. Frederick Douglass was insulted by that. He said Lincoln was a hypocrite. And in talking about Lincoln's evolving as a human being, as an ethical person, he went from being a hypocrite, Frederick Douglass's words, to being the real deal, I should say. But anyway, at that point, Lincoln was looked at as, Frederick Douglass said he was a hypocrite. Lincoln actually got together with other states to say, can we buy your slaves? And we'll free them, but we'll buy them first. They wouldn't go for that. They didn't want that. So Lincoln was wondering what to do. Some people were urging him, why don't you just ban slavery once and for all? Around this time, remember, you can't, because of the Constitution, you couldn't just ban slavery. You needed an amendment. But at this point, as a war measure, Lincoln writes the Emancipation Proclamation, which would free the slaves in the rebel states. More about that later. But William Seward told him, his Secretary of State told him, if you free the slaves now, that we haven't had any real victories, it's going to smell of desperation. You should wait to acquire a victory. And once you acquire that victory, then you can bring out the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln agreed and said, okay, took the Emancipation Proclamation, which would free the slaves, and filed it away. It would have to wait until things would change during the Civil War. That's all for now. This is John Franquiz. Send me your comments. Send me your likes. I hope I get some. Subscribe. Take care.